Putin is headed for defeat in Ukraine, and that would affect global stability. That's according to Liana Fix. She's a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Liana, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much.
So you write this, quote, any semblance of diplomatic dialogue among Russia, Ukraine, and the West has vanished. Why is that such a remote possibility?
It is because we've only seen negotiations at the very beginning of this war. In Istanbul, we had a round of negotiations between Ukraine and Russia in the immediate months after the war. But there are very fundamental doubts about Russia's willingness to negotiate seriously. So when we see now that Putin demands he's ready for negotiations if Ukraine just accepts that he has annexed 4 territories, there are a lot of doubts that he's just using that as a pretext to take a break and then to re-attack Ukraine. So negotiations need trust, and that's not what we have with Vladimir Putin as a negotiation partner.
So are any negotiations possible?
They will be possible, but the question is on which terms do those negotiations take place? Do they take place on Putin's terms, so he decides what are the preconditions? Or do they take place on an equal basis? So what Ukraine needs to do is to come into a position on the battlefield where Vladimir Putin is forced to take those negotiations seriously.
What makes you so sure that Russia is headed for defeat?
Well, the latest news that we've seen from Moscow right now is that Putin once again is restructuring his military leadership, putting again the general that was who was actually quite successful in the last months, putting him, giving him a demotion once again. So we see there is chaos and disorder on the Russian side. But that is just what we see right now. What we've seen in the last months is that all of Putin's war aims, which he had, have not been achieved. So there's really, in terms of his overall war aim, there's nothing that he can do to get back to the point where he wanted to occupy Ukraine and to change the government. So he's headed for defeat, which does not necessarily mean that Ukraine is headed for victory, because the form that defeat takes will be crucial.
That's the question. What does defeat look like for Putin?
Well, my colleague Michael Kimmich and I have tried to identify 3 options of defeat. One is defeat after negotiations on Ukraine terms, defeat after escalation. If Putin uses nuclear weapons, it would only accelerate his defeat. And the other is defeat after regime change, so domestic instability in Russia.
I want to talk to you about each of those,
yes,
especially the one about going nuclear. Under what circumstances would that happen?
We've seen in the past that Putin has tried to draw red lines around the new territories that he has annexed. And Ukraine immediately tested those red lines and called them a bluff. Putin didn't use nuclear weapons. So the question really is there a red line which is serious from Russia's side? And there are doubts about Crimea, sort of a military takeover of Crimea, that could be a red line where nuclear use could again come back into the equation. But for all the other territories, I think nuclear use at the moment is not something to be very concerned about.
So the other scenario is regime collapse, and you write this, quote, Russians will continue marching behind their inept czar only to a certain point. What is that point?
That point is when they have a feeling that this war is very much futile, that whatever amounts of their own sons they throw into this war, there's no turning point. So at the moment we see that for Russians it's very much, they continue their lives as it has been. There were 300,000 Russian men sent to Ukraine or prepared for being sent to Ukraine. There are rumors about a new wave of 500,000 Russian men to be sent to Ukraine. Only at that moment when Russians will feel this has a negative impact on my life, but it's not changing anything in Ukraine. We are still on the losing side. Might they have this feeling that Russians had in 1917 when Russia lost the First World War, that they might want to rebel against the leadership?
You also say that Russia's defeat would cause regional and global disorder. What would that look like? And more importantly, how does the U.S. prepare for that kind of disorder?
And that's one of the points we make. I mean, obviously Russia's defeat will open up a bright future for Ukraine. And it might also open up a bright future for other Russian neighbors. But we should be prepared for the other scenario, that it will not be a golden age of stability. And that's especially the case if we look at the South Caucasus and if we look at Central Asia. Because in those regions, we had inherent instabilities. We have China, which is trying to move into these regions for years. We have Turkey, which would use the vacuum that a Russian collapse in these regions would create to expand their own power. So the United States should prepare for that, not by being the dominant power in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. I mean, that would definitely be an overstretch, but to be aware that we will see major power plays in those regions and to offer an alternative to those countries and to say, if you look for stability, the United States can help you with that.
What's the best case scenario from the American perspective? What's the worst case scenario as far as geopolitics in that area go?
Let's start with the worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is certainly a regime change in Russia, which is unclear, where Russian nuclear weapons, or where it's unclear where Russian nuclear weapons will end. And this was also the concern after the end of the Soviet Union, which is also why back then the United States tried to keep the Soviet Union together, out of concern where will Russia's nuclear weapons go. So some kind of disorderly regime change, collapse of Russia, disintegration can be a really dangerous scenario. The best case scenario would be if Russia agrees to negotiations on Ukraine's terms, withdraws from Ukraine, and then we see some kind of reckoning in Russia, within the Russian leadership, which says, well, we need someone else than Putin. It will not become someone completely different, but it might be someone who's just a little bit more open to working on this terrible heritage and legacy that Russia has left in Ukraine.
All right, Liana, thank you so much.
Nice to talk to you. Nice to talk to you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.